Emily Carter and Sophie Clarke never met, never walked the same streets, and never shared a single moment. Yet within the same week, both would be dead, killed in their own homes by the men who once swore to love them. Emily Carter's life in Ohio seemed almost picture-perfect to anyone looking in from the outside. She lived in a small, sunlit apartment near the school where she worked, surrounded by plants and colorful books for her students. Her days were filled with laughter from the classroom and weekend trips to the farmer's market. She was the kind of person who remembered birthdays, sent thank-you cards, and always made time to listen to her friends' problems. In Manchester, England, Sophie Clarke was carving out her own version of happiness. Her small but stylish flat reflected her love for art and design, with framed prints on every wall and her desk always cluttered with sketches and ideas for her latest project. She had recently landed a promotion at the design firm where she worked, and her friends often joked that her career was moving faster than she could keep up. Despite living in different countries, the two women shared a quiet determination to build stable, meaningful lives. Emily had been dating Mark Jensen for nearly 2 years. He was someone she had met through a mutual friend at a barbecue, a man who at first seemed confident and charming. Sophie's relationship with Daniel Morris had started in a similar way, a chance meeting at a local art exhibition where he had admired her work and offered to buy her a drink. In the beginning, both relationships were filled with small gestures and the excitement that comes with falling in love. There were flowers, surprise dinners, and endless late-night conversations. For a while, both women believed they had found someone who understood them deeply. Yet beneath the surface, subtle cracks had already begun to form. Emily sometimes felt that Mark's attentiveness crossed into possessiveness, but she brushed it off, thinking it was simply a sign of how much he cared. Sophie noticed Daniel's occasional sharp tone when she spoke to other men, but she told herself it was harmless jealousy. These small moments were easy to overlook when balanced against the warmth and attention their partners seemed to offer. Life moved on, and those early red flags faded into the background. As winter settled in, both women were busy with work and personal goals. Emily was organizing a school play, pouring hours into rehearsals and set designs. Sophie was preparing to present a major advertising campaign to one of her firm's biggest clients. Neither woman could have imagined it. While they were focused on building their futures, the people they trusted most were quietly reshaping their lives in far darker ways. In Ohio, Mark had started making casual but persistent suggestions about Emily cutting back on her social activities, hinting that she seemed too busy for a relationship. In Manchester, Daniel began showing up unexpectedly at Sophie's office, under the pretense of taking her to lunch, though his real reason seemed to be keeping track of her. At the time, these behaviors didn't seem dangerous, just unusual. What Emily and Sophie didn't know was that their paths, so separate in geography, were moving toward the same kind of danger, bound together by choices neither had made, and a fate neither could see coming. The first warning signs appeared in small, almost forgettable ways. Emily noticed that Mark had begun asking for her phone when they were together, saying he just wanted to look something up or check the time. If she hesitated, his expression would change, a flicker of irritation replacing the easy smile she knew. Over time, these moments grew more frequent, and he began scrolling through her messages, questioning her about friends' names or casual conversations. At first, she laughed it off, thinking it was a quirk, but deep down she felt an unease she couldn't quite name. He started commenting on her clothes, saying some outfits were too much for work or too revealing for social gatherings. His words weren't shouted or cruel, just steady, insistent, and hard to dismiss. Sophie's experience with Daniel was different in tone but similar in effect. He had a way of framing his control as concern. If she mentioned going out with friends, he would ask endless questions about who would be there, what time she would be home, and whether she really felt safe walking back alone. At first she saw it as a sign that he cared for her well-being. But gradually, his questions became demands. He discouraged her from seeing certain friends, claiming they were a bad influence or didn't truly care about her. Soon her social life revolved almost entirely around him. For both women, the shift in their relationships happened so subtly that they barely registered it. In Emily's case, Mark began keeping track of how long she took to respond to texts, making remarks when she didn't reply quickly enough. If she explained she had been in class or busy, he would respond with silence, leaving her to feel guilty. Sophie faced something similar in her own way. Daniel would call her repeatedly during the day, even during important work meetings, and if she didn't pick up, she would later face a tense silence or passive comments about her priorities. Friends noticed changes before Emily or Sophie did. Emily's closest colleague asked her if everything was okay after overhearing one of Mark's calls, during which his voice was low but sharp, even from across the room. Sophie's best friend commented on how she rarely came to group gatherings anymore, and when she did, she always seemed distracted, glancing at her phone as if waiting for a message. Neither woman wanted to admit there was a problem. Emily believed that Mark's behavior was simply rooted in his love for her. Sophie told herself that Daniel's controlling habits were just a reflection of how much he valued their relationship. Admitting otherwise would mean confronting the uncomfortable reality that their relationships were shifting into something darker. Both relationships continued under this quiet tension, the control growing stronger with each passing week. What felt like minor intrusions at first became routine, almost normal. The danger was building, but it was hidden under the surface, disguised as affection, and it would be months before either woman understood how much it had taken hold of their lives. By late autumn, the patterns in both relationships had changed from subtle control to open displays of anger. Emily began finding unsettling reminders of Mark's temper in her daily life. After small disagreements, she would discover her belongings moved or damaged once. A framed photo of her and her friends lay face down on the floor. The glass cracked. Another time she opened her purse at work to find a handwritten note that read, "You can't ignore me forever." The words weren't signed, but she knew the handwriting. Each time, Mark dismissed her questions with a calm denial, claiming she was imagining things or being overly sensitive. In Manchester, Sophie's world was also tightening under Daniel's influence. If she stayed late at work, she would return to find him waiting outside her apartment building, leaning against the wall with a fixed expression. He would say he was just making sure she got home safe, but his presence always carried an unspoken tension. One evening, she unlocked her phone to see over 100 missed calls from him, all made within a span of 3 hours. When she finally returned his call, his voice was calm, too calm, and the conversation left her feeling unsettled. The tension in both homes became more noticeable to outsiders. In Ohio, neighbors occasionally heard shouting from Emily's apartment, followed by long stretches of silence. Some claimed they heard objects being thrown. Emily's friends began to notice that she seemed tired, her smile forced, her answers vague when they asked how she was. In Manchester, Sophie's co-workers picked up on similar changes. She grew quieter in meetings, avoided lunch with colleagues, and often glanced toward the entrance of the office as if expecting someone to appear. The escalation wasn't just emotional, it was physical in its presence. Emily recalled one night when Mark grabbed her wrist during an argument, his grip firm enough to leave a faint bruise. He apologized the next day, bringing flowers and insisting he'd been stressed. Sophie experienced her own moment of shock when Daniel punched the wall beside her head during an argument, his hand inches from her face. The sound of plaster cracking stayed with her long after the argument ended. Despite these frightening incidents, both women continued to hope the situations would improve. Emily told herself that Mark's outbursts were temporary, brought on by pressure at work. Sophie convinced herself that Daniel was simply passionate and that his temper was part of who he was. The thought of leaving felt overwhelming, not because they didn't want to escape, but because they feared the consequences of trying. What neither Emily nor Sophie realized was that the danger had already reached a point where retreating would be difficult. The controlling behavior had become routine, and the violent edge was growing sharper with each passing week. These were no longer just warning signs. They were precursors to something far more dangerous, the kind of turning point that could not be undone once crossed. The turning point for both women came quietly, without any dramatic moment to signal how close they were to real danger. For Emily, It happened on a bitterly cold January evening in Ohio. After weeks of tension and frequent arguments, she told Mark she needed space to think about their relationship. She said it calmly, hoping it would give them both time to cool off. He stared at her for a moment without responding, then walked out the door. She thought that was the end of it for the night, but hours later, when she stepped outside to head to the store, she found all 4 tires on her car slashed. The street was silent, the snow undisturbed except for a single set of footprints leading away from her driveway. She didn't see anyone, but she didn't need to. Her stomach tightened with the certainty of who was responsible. She didn't report it to the police, convincing herself it would only make things worse. In Manchester, Sophie faced her own moment of realization. Just days later, she had been feeling suffocated by Daniel's constant presence and decided to spend a few nights at a friend's flat to clear her head. She told him it was temporary, that she just needed time to think. The following afternoon, as she left work, she saw his car parked across the street from her office. He was sitting in the driver's seat, motionless, watching her. Her pulse quickened, but she forced herself to walk past without acknowledging him. Later that evening, her phone buzzed with a message from him. "I know where you are." She never replied, but the unease settled deep inside her, making it hard to sleep. The atmosphere around both women grew heavy in the days that followed. Emily found herself constantly glancing over her shoulder, locking her doors twice, checking her windows at night. Mark's absence wasn't a relief. It was a looming threat, as though he was just out of sight waiting for the right moment to reappear. Sophie experienced the same shadow of fear. She began varying her commute to work, taking different streets and public transport routes, in hopes of avoiding Daniel. Still, she spotted him more than once in unexpected places, a coffee shop near her office, the supermarket by her friend's building. Both women felt the weight of isolation more than ever. Emily didn't tell her family about the slashed tires, afraid they would pressure her to take legal action she wasn't ready for. Sophie avoided sharing the details with her friends, worried they would see her as helpless or reckless for staying in contact with Daniel at all. They each convinced themselves that if they could just handle things carefully, the situation might fade on its own. What they didn't know was that these incidents weren't just signs of possessiveness, they were rehearsals for something worse. Each man had crossed an invisible line, testing boundaries and finding no resistance strong enough to stop them. For Emily and Sophie, the path forward was already narrowing, and the space to escape was disappearing faster than they realized. On the morning of February 14th, a neighbor in Emily's apartment building noticed something unusual. Her car, which she normally drove to work before sunrise, was still parked outside well into the afternoon. The blinds in her living room were drawn tight, and no light escaped from inside. Concern grew when she failed to answer her phone calls or respond to messages from her colleagues. By evening, the police were contacted for a welfare check. When they entered her apartment, the scene inside was grim. Emily was lying on the living room floor, her body limp and still. Marks around her neck made the cause of death immediately clear: strangulation. The room showed signs of a struggle: a toppled chair, a smashed picture frame, and a scattering of books on the carpet. There was no sign of Mark. His phone was switched off, and his car was missing. 3 days later, across the Atlantic, the streets of Manchester were heavy with winter rain when Sophie's absence raised alarms. She had not shown up for work and hadn't contacted her office, which was unusual for someone known for her professionalism. A friend tried calling her throughout the day, without success. That evening, the friend went to Sophie's flat and knocked repeatedly, but there was no answer. When police forced entry, they were met with a chilling silence. Sophie was found in the hallway, collapsed against the wall. Multiple stab wounds marked her body, and blood had soaked deep into the carpet beneath her. There were no signs of forced entry, suggesting she had opened the door willingly to her killer. Both crime scenes shared an eerie familiarity: violence carried out with rage, yet with a disturbing sense of control. In Ohio, investigators found Emily's phone hidden beneath a cushion on the sofa, wiped of recent messages. In Manchester, Sophie's laptop was missing, along with her personal phone. The absence of these devices suggested that the killers had wanted to erase something, perhaps conversations, threats, or evidence of their planning. The initial investigations in each country began separately, but the focus in both was clear. In Ohio, Mark Jensen immediately became the prime suspect. Witnesses had seen him loitering near Emily's apartment days earlier, and his sudden disappearance only reinforced police suspicion. In Manchester, Daniel Morris was similarly at the center of attention. CCTV footage from nearby streets showed him entering Sophie's building the night before her body was discovered and leaving hours later with a backpack slung over his shoulder. The brutality of the crimes shocked both communities. In Ohio, neighbors who remembered Emily's warmth struggled to make sense of how her life had ended in such violence. In Manchester, Sophie's colleagues left flowers outside her office, their grief mixed with disbelief. Thousands of miles apart, the murders felt hauntingly similar in their cruelty and timing. But at that point, no one could have guessed that the two cases were connected by more than coincidence, or that the truth behind them was even darker than it appeared. In Ohio, the investigation into Emily's murder moved quickly. Detectives pieced together her final hours, interviewing friends, colleagues, and neighbors. Several recalled seeing Mark's car parked near her apartment in the days leading up to her death. Surveillance footage from nearby businesses confirmed his presence in the area, even late at night. Police also discovered that Mark had withdrawn several $1,000s in cash from multiple ATMs within a 24-hour period following Emily's murder. These withdrawals were spread across different towns, suggesting he was already on the move, carefully avoiding any pattern that might make him easy to track. His phone remained switched off, leaving investigators with no digital trail to follow. Across the Atlantic, Manchester police were facing a strikingly similar situation. Daniel Morris had vanished within hours of Sophie's death. CCTV cameras caught him leaving her apartment building in the early morning, his hood pulled low over his face. Just a few blocks away, another camera recorded him boarding a late-night ferry to Northern Ireland. From there, the trail became harder to follow. Bank records showed a rapid series of cash withdrawals at rural ATMs, each transaction small enough to avoid drawing immediate suspicion. Like Mark, Daniel had switched off his phone almost immediately after leaving the scene, cutting off one of the most effective ways detectives could trace him. Although the two investigations were unfolding in separate countries, the parallels between them were difficult to ignore. Both victims were young women in their 20s. Both had been killed in their homes by men they had been in relationships with, and in both cases, the suspects had disappeared almost immediately after the murders. The timing was another unsettling detail. Emily's death on February 14th and Sophie's just 3 days later. The methods were different, but the planning, sudden vanishings, and calculated efforts to evade detection were alarmingly alike. The similarities became impossible to overlook when Interpol shared a routine update with police in both countries. In comparing international alerts for wanted suspects, analysts noticed that Mark Jensen and Daniel Morris were of similar age, had a similar build, and had both been using large sums of cash rather than bank cards after fleeing. At first, investigators assumed it was a coincidence, but the timing and patterns were too precise to ignore. Both men seemed to have vanished into isolated areas, avoiding large cities, and both appeared to have some knowledge of how to cover their tracks. Detectives in Ohio and Manchester began exchanging information directly. They compared timelines, suspect behaviors, and even the missing items from each crime scene. The absence of the victims' phones in both cases stood out, suggesting that the killers had been deliberate in removing anything that could contain incriminating conversations or evidence of threats. Though the link between the two cases was not yet proven, the mounting list of similarities hinted at something deeper, a connection that, if real, would mean the murders were not separate tragedies, but pieces of a larger, far more disturbing puzzle. The link between the two murders began to take shape when digital forensics teams in both countries dug deeper into the backgrounds of Mark Jensen and Daniel Morris. Interpol analysts, now working closely with detectives from Ohio and Manchester, traced fragments of online activity that had survived the suspects' attempts to erase their digital footprints. While neither man's phone had been recovered, Older data from their laptops and online accounts revealed a surprising overlap. Years earlier, both had been active members of the same online gaming forum. At first, their interactions appeared casual, discussions about game strategies, computer builds, and tournament updates. But as investigators scrolled through archived threads, the tone of their conversations began to shift. Over time, Mark and Daniel had moved from public posts to private messages, forming a friendship built not on shared hobbies, but on shared frustrations. The messages grew darker, laced with resentment toward their partners and cynical views about women in general. Investigators uncovered exchanges where they encouraged one another to stand their ground and not let themselves be disrespected. The most chilling discovery came from encrypted chat logs stored on an old backup server. In these private conversations, the men openly discussed controlling behaviors, justifying acts of intimidation, and sharing stories of arguments with their girlfriends. The tone was casual, almost boastful, as though they saw their behavior as justified rather than dangerous. In the weeks leading up to the murders, the chats became even more disturbing. Both men expressed anger over their partners pulling away, Emily asking for space, Sophie staying at a friend's flat. They spoke about how they felt humiliated, how they believed their partners were trying to leave, and how they would make sure it ended on their terms. While there was no explicit plan written out in detail, the timing of their messages, combined with the events that followed, painted a clear picture. Each had been feeding the other's rage, validating actions that should have raised alarm. What unsettled investigators most was the possibility that the killings were not just parallel crimes but acts fueled by a shared mindset. Though each murder was committed alone, the influence they had on one another in those final weeks was undeniable. The supportive tone of their messages turned what might have been individual acts of impulsive violence into calculated decisions. Neither had tried to talk the other down. Instead, they had built an echo chamber, each man reinforcing the other's worst instinct. As police pieced this together, the narrative shifted. These were no longer simply two cases of domestic violence ending in murder. They were the tragic result of a toxic connection that had spanned years and crossed an ocean. The shared digital trail was enough to convince authorities in both countries that the men were linked, not by coincidence, but by choice. A connection that had made their crimes more deliberate, more confident, and ultimately more lethal. Mark Jensen's capture came first. Nearly 3 weeks after Emily's murder, a motel receptionist in rural Kentucky recognized him from a wanted poster circulated by local police. He had checked in under a false name, paying in cash and keeping to himself, but his appearance, unkempt hair, dark circles under his eyes, matched the description she had seen online. She quietly contacted authorities, and within hours, unmarked police vehicles surrounded the motel. Mark was taken into custody without resistance, though investigators noted his complete lack of visible emotion when informed of the charges against him. In his room, police found a small duffel bag containing clothes, cash, and a prepaid phone with only a handful of numbers stored. Daniel Morris was located a week later in a remote village in County Donegal, Ireland. He had been staying in a rented cottage under a false identity, doing odd jobs for cash to avoid using banks. Locals described him as polite but withdrawn, rarely speaking unless necessary. His arrest was more complicated than Mark's. He attempted to flee through the back of the property when officers arrived, leading to a brief chase through the rain-soaked fields before he was cornered and handcuffed. In the cottage, police found Sophie's missing phone hidden inside a sealed box beneath a floorboard, along with a knife matching the type used in the murder. The extradition processes were swift. Mark was returned to Ohio to face trial for Emily's killing, while Daniel was brought back to Manchester to stand before a UK court for Sophie's murder. In both trials, prosecutors presented not only the physical evidence, but also the damning digital history linking the two men. Screenshots of their encrypted messages were shown to juries, revealing how they had encouraged each other's violent thoughts in the days before the murders. The prosecution argued that while the men had not planned the crimes together in a literal sense, the mutual validation they provided had acted as a catalyst, pushing each past the point of no return. In Ohio, the jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before finding Mark guilty of first-degree murder. In Manchester, Daniel's trial concluded with the same verdict. Both men received life sentences with no possibility of parole for decades. Neither offered an apology or explanation during sentencing, leaving families and friends of the victims with unanswered questions that would never be resolved. The aftermath of the cases rippled far beyond the courtrooms. Media outlets in both countries reported extensively on the murders, focusing on the online connection between the killers and the role it had played in escalating their behavior. Domestic violence advocates used the cases to highlight how emotional control and isolation often precede physical harm, stressing that early intervention could prevent tragedies like these. Emily and Sophie's stories became a shared reminder that danger can grow quietly, in ways that are easy to dismiss until it's too late. Though separated by an ocean, their lives had been drawn together by forces they never saw, and their deaths stood as a haunting testament to the destructive power of unchecked obsession and the silence that allows it to thrive.